Hi, I am here. You are here. It is Thursday. That means I'll host a hangout tonight at 8 p.m. East. I hope to see you there. And I have a really, really great conversation with Tim Wise today. He's absolutely on fire. You don't want to miss it. It starts at 27 minutes. Real good stuff today. Tell your friends. Definitely, you're going to want to hear this one. Also, yesterday at the top of the show, I mentioned that our friend Kevin Richbert has 60 jars of honey left. Well, now he's only got 48 because we moved 12 yesterday. But it is my goal to sell out all of this honey. I'm pushing it everywhere because it's so good. And Kevin is such a great guy, and I like helping him out. And it's just a great community building thing. Kevin joins us at our hangout tonight, so you can buy it from him personally there. Slate Hill, edibleforest.com. It's the best honey in the world. I think he gets $20 for it. I get nothing for it but joy in helping my friend. And it's an investment into his amazing farm in upstate New York, which hopefully we're all going to get together and be at this summer. Go buy Kevin's honey right now. Slate Hill, edibleforest.com. Hope you're doing okay on this Thursday here at the end of January. Lots to talk about. Horrific news. You might have seen it before you went to bed last night, but an American Airlines commercial plane carrying at least 60 passengers and 4 crew members collided with a U.S. Army Black Hawk helicopter carrying 3 soldiers last night around 9 p.m. while trying to land at Reagan Washington National Airport outside Washington, D.C. The first major U.S. commercial air crash in almost 16 years. Search and rescue efforts, of course, underway immediately. At least like 18 bodies have been found. No survivors as of about 4 a.m. when I'm doing this report. And to make it all worse, I'm sorry, this is not exactly good stuff to open the show. To make it all worse, the President of the United States is Donald Trump. That's right. And he was briefed on it last night, and he put out a statement that said, "I've been fully briefed on the terrible accident which just took place at Reagan National Airport. May God bless their souls. Thank you for the..." I get nothing from this. I just love Kevin, and I want to help him out a little bit, and I want to invest in his farm, and I want to meet all of you at his farm this summer. We're actually planning that details now, and I'll tell you when we finish, or when we have something to say, for an extended period of time. It's a clear night. The lights on the plane were blazing. Why didn't the helicopter go up or down or turn? Why didn't the control tower tell the helicopter what to do instead of asking if they saw the plane? This is a bad situation that looks like it should have been prevented. Not good. Really? That's the statement that he put out. That's the statement that he put out. Why didn't the helicopter go up or down or turn? I mean, I told this to 2 people off air over the last week based on all the unraveling and confusion around the federal government. I said, God forbid there's a commercial airline accident because the FAA is understaffed or disorganized or confused. And I'm definitely not saying that was the case. But that's my speculation that something could have gone wrong, and it could be the fault of the federal government or the control tower. Could also just be an accident, but I'm sure we're going to have all kinds of conspiracy theories. Already, I think you see them being hatched by the president. Why didn't the helicopter just go up or down? It's just absolutely awful in terms of the loss of life, but everything is worse when the person in charge is Donald Trump. You just feel so much less secure. This is going to make people, I think, probably to some extent worried about air travel. I hope not, but really terrible news coming out of Washington, D.C. and for our nation last night. And I didn't want to open with that, but I just saw it and I couldn't avoid it. And now I feel like it's too late for the good stuff. And so I'm just going to continue on with these headlines that I've got for you. I've got a lot of great clips and an amazing conversation with Tim Wise today. So let's get to the rest of the news before this terrible accident outside of Washington, D.C. or in Washington, D.C. Here is the big news from yesterday. Of course, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. continued to embarrass his family and his family name during his 3 hours of bruising questions for his first Senate confirmation hearing to become Health and Human Services Secretary. He rejected accusations that he was anti-vaccine, even though we know he is. He repeatedly sought to steer the conversation toward different topics, like combating chronic disease, but he didn't do a very good job. One of his most important exchanges was with the Senator from Louisiana, Bill Cassidy, who is a Republican physician whose vote is expected to be crucial. Cassidy asked about Medicare and Medicaid. Kennedy appeared to have little familiarity with the enormous health insurance programs, at times seeming to confuse them. Shocking. He'll sit for another confirmation hearing today. He made plain that he intends to do things a different way, according to New York Times reporter Cheryl Gay Stolberg. He spent the better part of his last decade or more sowing doubts about some of the very agencies that he would oversee. And there's all kind of fact-checking being done and lots more to say about his confirmation hearings yesterday. But in other news, Trump administration pulled back its spending freeze. They rescinded an order that froze trillions of dollars in federal grants and loans in an effort to purge the government. What Trump called woke ideology. The directive has been temporarily blocked by a federal judge. It's created more confusion by rescinding the order. The Trump administration appeared to ease concerns from hospitals, nonprofits, and others who'd spent the last 2 days scrambling to understand if they'd lost their federal financial support. It's just absolute chaos. We expected this, but watching it play out is really challenging. At least he has pulled back from the brink for a couple of days, rescinding that order, but still creating a tremendous amount of confusion. Yesterday, the former senator from New Jersey, Robert Menendez, who cried many times in court, one of the most powerful Democrats in Washington, was sentenced to 11 years in prison on corruption charges. He's been convicted of being at the center of a years-long international bribery scheme, and it brought a humiliating end to his 5-decade career. He's 71 years old, and he's now going to be most remembered for his decision to accept gold bars and bribes, blame his wife. Terrible story. I feel horrible for his daughter, Alicia Menendez, who is an anchor and journalist over at MSNBC. I got to know pretty well back in the day. Really, really cool person, and I feel terrible for her. But Menendez apparently is like pleading to Trump and saying nice things to Trump. He's really hoping for a pardon, obviously. So that is also a big news story from yesterday, and also so much for the Biden administration, Department of Justice, weaponizing, the Department of Justice. They went after Democrats, including Hunter Biden and Robert Menendez, who's now going to jail. So there's that. Also this, interest rates. Federal Reserve officials held interest rates steady following the first policy meeting to take place during the second Trump administration. The decision comes despite Trump's pressure on policymakers to drive rates lower. So that was big news yesterday. Also, in Ukraine, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has accused Vladimir Putin of being afraid to negotiate after his Russian counterpart refused to engage in peace talks with him, once again questioned his legitimacy. Over at our Department of Justice, federal prosecutors moved to drop their last remaining efforts to prosecute Trump's 2 co-defendants in the classified documents case brought by the former special counsel Jack Smith. In a single-page filing, prosecutors asked a federal appeals court in Atlanta to dismiss an appeal that had been filed before he took office to reinstate criminal charges against the 2 men, Walt Nauta and Carlos de Oliveira. So they're getting off now, too. And in a new unfortunate low, Trump signed an immigration detention measure into law, marking the first legislative win of his second term as the Republican-led Congress angles to execute his agenda. Steve Madden, writing over at Maddow Blog, the House gave its final approval of a bill last Wednesday. 46 Democrats joined all Republicans in favor of the bill. The measure also passed the Senate last week, 64-35, 12 Democrats breaking with the party to back it. It's called the Laken Riley Act. Laken Riley is the name of a nursing school student who was murdered last year in Athens, Georgia by a Venezuelan citizen who had entered the United States illegally, was convicted of her murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The act requires Immigration and Customs Enforcement, that's ICE, to detain undocumented immigrants who are arrested or face charges or who have been convicted of burglary, theft, larceny, or shoplifting. A lot more details in this piece of legislation, but I'm moving on to the next story, which is that the latest federal education assessments assessments found that 33% of 8th graders and 40% of 4th graders have below basic reading skills. The worst in decades. Children's reading skills reached new lows. And I blame the President of the United States, Donald Trump, for that. So there you go. Those are your headlines for today, Thursday. We'll talk about it all tonight and so much more at the Hangout. I hope to see you at 8 Eastern, and we'll definitely find some good stuff. We'll share some good stuff. We'll find the joy, and we'll connect with our community to try to find the way forward and always make each other laugh in the moment. So be there tonight. I can't wait to see you. And now on to the sound bites I've got for you, the audio clips, the montage of commentary that I've collected for you each and every day here at Stand Up. Let's start with a 5-minute segment from CNN's The Lead with Jake Tapper, which recaps some of, or a good bit of, the RFK confirmation hearing and does some fact checking at the same time. I like this a lot. I'm including the whole almost 5 minutes from CNN and Jake Tapper.
Today on Capitol Hill, Kennedy faced some tough questions from senators in his first of 2 confirmation hearings. Lawmakers on the Senate Finance Committee grilled him about his unscientific falsehoods about vaccines, including his role in the deadly measles outbreak in Samoa. Both Democrats and Republicans also had questions about his changed stance on abortion. He once supported legal abortion. He seems to now not have that position. He also appeared to find support from the majority of Republicans on today's panel. In just a moment, we're going to have a full breakdown of the hearing and where Kennedy's chances of confirmation stand right now in this Republican-controlled Senate. But first, we want to show you just a couple examples of how the answers we heard from Kennedy on Capitol Hill today at times seemed quite different from his past remarks when it comes to vaccines. Much of the controversy Kennedy is known for, aside from admitting to dumping a dead bear in Central Park, is his anti-vaccine rhetoric and conspiracy theory-laden stances. But today, in his opening statement, perhaps knowing that this was a potential problem for his confirmation, he said this.
Vaccines play a critical role in healthcare. All of my kids are vaccinated. I've written many books on vaccines. My first book in 2014, the first line of it is, I am not anti-vaccine, and the last line is, I am not anti-vaccine.
But, of course, there's plenty of evidence in Kennedy's own words to suggest he is anti-vaccine, at least not pro-vaccine, 20 years of this. Exhibit A, this is just one of many results we could bring to you. A podcast in July of 2023.
Can you name any vaccines that you think are good?
I think some of the live virus vaccines are probably averting more problems than they're causing. There's no vaccine that is, safe and effective.
There's no vaccine that's safe and effective? Excuse me? That seems pretty cut and dry. But today, when questioned about this specific statement, Kennedy blamed it on the interviewer. The interviewer cut him off, and what he was going to say, that there's no vaccine that is safe and effective for every person. Okay, so even if that is what he was trying to say, there is plenty of evidence showing Kennedy's recent embrace of vaccine-related conspiracy theories. Here's Exhibit B, going on Joe Rogan's podcast, again in 2023, spreading misinformation about the pandemic from 1918, the Spanish flu.
Very, very strong evidence. The Spanish flu was vaccine-induced flu. The deaths were vaccine-induced, but originally they said it was a flu. But when they've gone back and actually they have all the samples from thousands of people, they died from bacteriological pneumonia.
This is very, very confusing and ahistoric. The 1918 Spanish flu pandemic was caused by an H1N1 virus. It was not caused by a vaccine. Not to mention the flu vaccine or even antibiotic treatments were not available in 1918. The first license for wide use of a flu vaccine was in 1945. According to the space-time continuum, 1918 is before 1945. RFK Jr. later in that same Joe Rogan interview might have realized he'd gone a bit too far.
I shouldn't talk about this, Joe.
Okay, so
I don't remember enough about it.
I shouldn't talk about this, Joe. Words to live by, Mr. Kennedy. Again, this is the Health and Human Services Secretary nominee. Kennedy took a vaccine-friendly tone today, but that contrasts with his other remarks in books, public appearances, decades of speaking, and perhaps even onesies. Onesies? Yeah, you heard me. Independent Senator Bernie Sanders today questioned Kennedy's support for a group called the Children's Health Defense. That's an organization that Kennedy chaired up until a couple months ago. It sells baby onesies that promote being anti-vaccine. One says, unvaxxed, unafraid. The other says, no vax, no problem.
Next one. Are you supportive of these onesies?
I'm supportive of vaccines.
Are you supportive of this clothing, which is militantly anti-vaccine?
I am supportive of vaccines. I will. I want good science.
If the onesie fits.
Yeah, if the onesie fits. Hilarious listening to Senator Sanders talk about the onesie, just him saying the onesie. But it's also awful and terrifying. If it wasn't, it would be funnier, but it's not. So I'm not laughing. Are you laughing? Okay. Well, here is another great montage. This is from, I think, MSNBC producers put this together. It was on the Joy Reid show, which I was watching a little bit of last night. And they basically just took his statements that were he was saying in a confirmation hearing and put them up against the statements that he had said in the past on different appearances on podcasts, shows, etc. And I thought this was really well done, so I want to share it with you.
Mr. Kennedy, did you say that COVID-19 was a genetically engineered bioweapon that targets black and white people but spared Ashkenazi Jews and Chinese people?
I didn't say it was deliberately targeted. COVID-19 is targeted to attack Caucasians and black people. The people who are most immune are Ashkenazi Jews and Chinese.
Did you say Lyme disease is a highly likely militarily engineered bioweapon?
I probably did say that. It's another thing that keeps us from enjoying the outdoors and keeps us locked inside. And the idea that this may have been is highly likely to have been a military weapon.
Did you say that exposure to pesticides causes children to become transgender?
No, I never said that. The capacity for these chemicals that we are just raining down on our children right now to induce these very profound sexual changes in them is something we need to be thinking about as a society.
Did you say on a podcast, and I quote, I wouldn't leave abortion to the states. My belief is we should leave it to the woman. We shouldn't have the government involved, even if it's full term. Did you say that, Mr. Kennedy?
Senator, I believe that every abortion is a tragedy. I wouldn't leave it to the states.
You wouldn't, right.
No, I would.
You would say completely, it's up to the woman.
My belief is we should leave it to the woman. We shouldn't have government involved.
Even if it's full term.
Even if it's full term.
Well, how on earth does that last statement not disqualify him amongst Republican senators? How are they not all bringing up his stance on abortion, even if it's full term? Surprised that we didn't hear more about that yesterday. Did we hear anything about that yesterday, by the way? If he wasn't Trump's pick, I think that's all we would have heard about from Republicans. But I didn't hear anything. I didn't watch the whole hearings. But let me know if I'm missing that. All right, and we'll move on from RFK Jr. to here are several governors. This is the Governor Kotek from Oregon. You've got first, I think you hear Tim Walz from Minnesota, and then J.B. Pritzker from Illinois, all talking about the confusion that Trump has created for governors and for states and the federal government yesterday.
Donald Trump's reckless action cut off funding to law enforcement, farmers, schools, child care, veterans, and health care. While he was out golfing, he threw the country into crisis.
I can tell you that when federal funds that are meant to serve the most vulnerable Oregonians are suspended or unavailable, that has impact on Oregonians, and it's a dereliction of the federal government's duty to protect Americans.
Donald Trump's administration is lying to you. The White House's attempt to walk back what they did today does not match what we saw on the ground.
All right. 3 Democratic governors yesterday criticizing Trump's confusing and chaotic order. from 2 days ago. And now let's go back to MSNBC with Joy Reid, who had Stacey Abrams on. I thought this was a really good, important exchange, and it coincides with my conversation with Tim Wise today, so I wanted to share it with you. Stacey Abrams is so good, as always.
And Stephen Miller in the last administration and this one was very much in his ear, and you just heard his obsession with racial minorities, in his mind, taking things away from white men. And it feels like Donald Trump right now is being led, and the White House is really being led by people like him and by the people who wrote Project 2025, because they're obsessed with these issues of what they see as sort of racial theft from white men. Do you read their EOs that way?
I read it more broadly, because we have to recognize that while Donald Trump may be the avatar, he's not an outlier. As long as the rest of the Republican Party suborn what is happening, whether it's Stephen Miller at the podium or a U.S. senator, they are all agreeing to the premise of Project 2025, which is they want to hoard opportunity and legalize discrimination. We have spent 248 years as a nation undoing our original sins, which include slavery, silencing women, denying Native Americans their citizenship, a whole host of challenges. But what we've done since then, we've passed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which, by the way, you can't rescind with an executive order. We passed the 19th Amendment, but we also passed Title I, which focuses on poor children having access to education. So if you are a vice president who graduated from high school in the Appalachian Mountains and you went to a Title I funded school, you are a DEI graduate. We know that across this country, service-disabled veterans who have access to resources do so because of the Americans with Disabilities Act, a DEI law. So let's be clear. They may try to make this a racial issue, but they're coming for everyone that they don't believe is worthy of their very narrow-minded ideal of what it means to be an American. DEI is foundational values: diversity, meaning all people; equity, meaning fair access to opportunity; and inclusion, having a pathway to the American dream. They are trying to block it, and they're hoping we don't notice.
Yeah, well, we're noticing, and we're going to do everything we can to stop it, prevent it, and take care of those who are affected by it, I hope. Okay, well, now I want to get to something. I think it is kind of good stuff. I suppose I could have played this earlier, but it's Heather Cox Richardson, the historian. She said this. I don't know where I found this, who she was doing an interview with. She talks to everybody but me, but I've tried. Hopefully I'll get around at some point, but here she is.
Really important things to remember going forward as we fear the rise of authoritarianism in the United States. Authoritarians cannot rise if there are strong communities and people are acting with joy. That is, you need despair and anger in order for an authoritarian to rise. Think of the language that we hear from MAGA Republicans and how angry they are all the time. It's okay to say, I'm not going to pay attention to politics for a while, but it's not okay to stop bringing your best to the world. Whatever those things are that you bring to the community, do them and do them with joy. And don't stop doing the things you love because you're scared, because that actually is a form of resistance. Showing up and doing things you love says to an authoritarian, you have no place to root here. And that's going to be really important going forward.
Yes, great advice. Let's do it. Let's apply it. Let's implement it. Let's do it tonight at our hangout. How about it? All right. Actor and thinker and woodworker Nick Offerman. Everybody likes Nick Offerman, right? We love Nick Offerman. He was on Zateo with Mehdi Hassan, and they were shitting on Elon Musk, and I'm here for it. And now you are too.
That the richest man in the world and his ilk. I keep saying, I can't understand these billionaires are so ego driven. You know, Bezos doesn't endorse a candidate because ostensibly, from what I read, he wants to get favorable contracts for his rocket ship company.
Yeah. That's the allegation. Yeah.
If you have that kind of budget, it would be so easy to take a fraction of your fortune and be the coolest person on the planet. If you just call up Chef Jose Andres and say, hey, here's 20 billion, feed the world. The fact that the richest guy in the world feels the need to like buy a social media platform to try it in the hopes that somehow people will think he's cool or funny, and then to go jumping around like a dipshit at a Trump rally is just unfathomable. I think it's really sad. It speaks to somebody who I think just needs a hug, somebody to say, "Hey, buddy, you did a good job."
Don't you? I mean, I'm not a psychoanalyst, but I do find it interesting when you say you need a hug, and you look at Donald Trump and Elon Musk, both of whom had major daddy issues, major issues with fathers who didn't seem to love them in the way they wanted to be loved. And I wonder whether the rest of the world is now being punished because they had shit parenting.
Yes. I love that. I love that conversation as much as I hated it. All right. Finally, how about some laughs from Jimmy Kimmel? Jimmy Kimmel Live making fun of Bobby Kennedy Jr.
Oh, we have so much to get to. Another weird day in Washington today where a man who does not believe in medical science may soon be in charge of medical science. Robert Kennedy Jr., Donald Trump's pick to run the Department of Health and Human Services, faced the Senate today. Bob and his brainworm answered questions for 3.5 hours. Yesterday, his first cousin, Caroline Kennedy, daughter of JFK, made a video opposing his confirmation and adding to the long list of crazy stories about this crazy person.
His basement, his garage, his dorm room were always the center of the action, where drugs were available, and he enjoyed showing off how he put baby chickens and mice in a blender to feed to his hawks.
Well, that explains why he lost the job at Jamba Juice, I guess. He put baby chickens and mice in a blender to feed his hawks. And guess what? Not one of the 27 senators on the Finance Committee asked him about it today. Not one. We've reached the point where these cabinet picks are so nutty, the idea that one of them was making Stuart Little smoothies doesn't even come up. They did grill him on the subject of abortion and vaccines, subjects on which he has very conveniently evolved since pledging allegiance to the Cantaloupe in Chief. Most of his defense today was some version of, I didn't say the Moderna vaccine turned kids gay. I said it turned some of them bisexual. The hearing...
All right, that is what I've got for you. There you go. Headlines and clips, and now an amazing conversation with Tim Wise. I really wanted to get to this today, and Tim is just the best. He's going to join us in Las Vegas. You can meet him in person, talk to him, Q&A, all of it. We're going to hang out on March 28th to 30th. I hope to see you there so you can meet Tim. But this conversation today, we covered a lot, but he's just really on fire. I mean, he always is, but I just... So much of what he had to say today was so on point and resonated so much, and it was just brilliant wisdom. The way that he can recall these facts and figures and these arguments, it's his life's work, but nobody's better at it than Tim is, I think, in all of the world of white people against racism. That's for damn sure. Tim really is top notch, and you can follow him, you can support him, you can read him, get all of his books, follow him on Blue Sky and Twitter. He's still on Twitter, and he's now a senior fellow at the African American Policy Forum, created by Kim Crenshaw, the great Kim Crenshaw. And it's just, that's, what else can I tell you? Tim Wise, you know him, you love him, let's do it. Yeah, Tim Wise, who is being kept real busy by everything that's happening. So I really appreciate you setting aside some time to talk to us and help interpret a lot of what's happening. Thank you for joining me, buddy. Good to see you.
You bet. Good to see you. Week one of the shittery and fuckery has begun and ended. So we're in week 2 now.
How are you? It's important that someone like you, in my mind, stays focused and stable and emotionally sound so that you can do the important work that you're doing. I've also left open the potential that you come undone more than twice a day, but then get back to it in the hopes for people like you. That's what I'm trying to do. How are you just emotionally dealing with seeing all of the anguish, the pain, the fear, the concern, the confusion, and how it's affecting folks? How are you doing?
On the one hand, I'm doing as horribly as you can expect. It's a stressful time, and I'm deeply concerned about all the things that we're seeing. At the same time, I'm trying to take a breath and remember that is the purpose of this flurry of activity that we saw in the first week in terms of executive orders. As much as anything, this flurry of activity is intended to intimidate psychologically. It's really it needs to be understood as psychological warfare more than policy warfare. And the reason I say that is not because real damage can't be done. Real damage can be and already has been done. But in the case of most of these EOs, I think the administration knows they're going to be blocked by the courts. In most cases, there's just too much evidence that one after another of these is likely to be found unconstitutional. And several of them have already been held up by the courts. But I think that, or in the case of the rescission of funding, that was already held up by the courts and now it's been repealed. And a lot of this stuff they're doing.
Birthright citizenship too was.
Yeah, and birthright citizenship is that has been put on stay because it's blatantly unconstitutional. But understand something. They know that. They're not, as much as we joke about them being stupid, their attorneys know full well that they're likely to lose a lot of these battles. But by throwing everything at the wall, like pasta, to see if it's done or whatever and see what'll stick, they know that it's going to, or it's intended to overwhelm those of us who are fighting for justice and equity and fairness and cause us to become so demoralized or so scattered in our response that we just run around with our hair on fire. And I think what I'm trying to do, and I think for the most part in the 9 days since the inauguration I've managed to do it, is I'm trying to be appropriately concerned and alarmed while at the same time realizing that the people being targeted right now by these administration efforts have overcome odds that were at least as great, if not greater. They have faced odds that were at least as great, if not greater, and they have persevered in the face of intense oppression that is even greater than what we are seeing right now with these executive orders. In that regard, we do not have the luxury, I think, of acting like the sky is falling, even though we know it could, because indeed we have to be strong and we have to be relatively healthy in order to be part of the resistance. So taking a beat, taking a breath, we have to work 20 hours a day to fight these people. You got to take a break, do something mindless. The last week I've been, after about 5 or 6 o'clock at night, I just shut it off and I watch mindless episodic not mindless, stuff like Severance is actually really good, but just watching like episodic television that has nothing, and sometimes even more dystopian, like Severance is way more dystopian than what we're facing right now. And it reminds me like things can get worse.
Good.
So let's make sure that doesn't happen.
Yeah. Thanks for taking us inside your kind of personal practice. I think that's important that we all share those things, especially those of us who are fighting for justice, equity, and fairness, which you've been doing your whole career. I like to think I have been for much of my career as following you and many others. And I got to just take a step back and look at where we're at when it comes to that fight. It feels like the Trump administration, Republicans, the right in America and across the world is trying to really turn back the clock, not only in terms of culture, but really in terms of policy. One thing I said the other day, and I want to get your take on it, I was just thinking out loud, is it seems like in America at least, black folks and people who have been historically marginalized have much more of a different stake, more of a foothold, more ownership, more involvement in all kinds of institutions. And also the tables are a little flatter in terms of access to elevate your voice with social media. It's not just 3 networks and a newspaper and obviously trying to get coverage for an actual protest. A lot has changed. And so there's been a lot of advancement while they're trying to turn back the clock. It feels as a result of that, specifically, let's say the fight for Black Lives Matter, black folks in America have really taken advantage of all these different networks. I'm seeing Black TikTok and all these different things to share ideas, share strategies, and tell the truth over here on Earth One. So the question is, how much is it different as they try to turn back the clock policy-wise to 1963? How much is it different now, given what I've just tried to lay out?
It's both worse and better. It's worse in the sense that their side has the ability to spread their nonsense, their falsehoods, their half-truths, their manipulations and distortions at light speed. But it also is good in the sense that we have the capacity and the tools with which to respond. Let me put it this way. If Ronald Reagan had thought to do the kind of things that Donald Trump is trying to do now, and he wouldn't have, that's how disturbing the situation today is. Reagan wouldn't have done this, as bad as Reagan was. Bush 1 and Bush 2 would never have done this. Nixon would not have done this, as bad as they were. If they had, though, our side would have been much more screwed in the sense that our ability to fight back would have relied on what? A mimeograph machine and a fax?
Right.
to get our arguments. What would we have done? We wouldn't have had social media. We wouldn't have had the capacity to send around responses. And for instance, this uproar about the rescission of government funding, which was just this OMB decision intended to please Russ Vought, who's going to become the head of OMB probably at the end of the week, is something that now has been rescinded. I don't believe for 1 second that was not related to the public outcry and uproar on the part of people, including a lot of people in Trump supporting states who were like, wait a minute, you're cutting all kinds of things that benefit people on the ground, including some of your own voters. This is stuff that people rely on. And that uproar would have been a lot harder to manifest in a broad way 20 years ago, 30 years ago. So I don't want us to lose sight of the fact that, as you said, we do have tools right now, and we have communities that know how to use those tools. So we are not bereft of a response. We are not, but Trump wants everyone to think, by flooding the zone with shit, as Steve Bannon famously said years ago, that his victory and triumph and power is unassailable, inevitable, and complete. And it is none of those things. It has been said, and this is not untrue in many ways, that executive orders are basically inner office memos on better stationery, right? And in some ways that's true because they do not overturn existing law. You cannot issue an executive order that actually repeals the Civil Rights Act. You cannot issue an executive order that repeals the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. You can issue executive orders about staffing in government, which is going to lead to a lot of people losing their jobs. That's awful. You can do an executive order that would do some of the stuff at the border that he's trying to do. That's awful. But the vast majority of this other stuff, it cannot overturn existing law. You cannot just simply say, and this is something we have to understand, because some of our side was saying a lot of untruth a week ago because they don't understand the difference, and we can't be spreading misinformation. So for us to say, oh my God, Executive Order 11246 from 1965 was overturned, so now it's legal to discriminate again. No, that's not the truth. Executive Order 11246 is not the only thing that keeps discrimination illegal. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, as amended since, does that. The Voting Rights Act of 65, the Housing Act of 68. When we don't understand the somewhat paper tiger aspect of some of these decisions that he's making, we give him more power than he actually possesses. I'm not saying that repealing 11246 isn't a big deal. It is, because it's part of the canon of civil rights and anti-discrimination law. But almost everything in that order is now covered by other civil rights legislation, which cannot be overturned just because Donald Trump gets a pen and a piece of paper put in front of him. So we need to be clear about that, because when we're not clear on it, we run around like the sky is falling when, and I'm not saying it's not bad, but when it's not falling and then people go, oh my God, it's over. We've lost. And there's nothing we can do. And it's not true. There are plenty of things that can still be done.
Yeah, the confusion is real, and the confusion and uncertainty creates fear and panic and disorganization, and that is what it's meant to do. So Tim is saying we have to see that for what it is and do our best to cut through the bullshit and combat it. Just in terms of the federal government as an employer to black and brown folks, it's my understanding, a lot of black and brown folks go to work for the federal government because of those protections, the anti-discrimination protections and so on. It would seem that they're trying to not only obviously clean out the federal government, destroy the federal government, fire everybody apparently, but make sure whoever does work there, they are loyalists. And they can't possibly be someone who would care about these types of issues. How much truth do you think there is to just trying to get rid of black and brown folks, regardless of their politics, but anyone who might be attracted to work in the federal government, also because they might have a disability or they might be gay? There are so many protections for folks to work there that there aren't necessarily in private sector jobs.
First off, the reason that black folks,
what I just said, is that all?
Yeah, the reason that black folks are disproportionately represented in government positions is not because they just automatically want to work for the state or the government. It is because there was a recognition beginning years ago that the private sector was far less amenable to anti-discrimination practices and policies, was far more likely to get around anti-discrimination law. Because if you think about it, private sector hiring is much more given to old boys networks and connections, right? Civil service, at least theoretically, is something where once you get in on the ground floor, then you move up. You have different levels of civil service. And so you get these merit-based promotions based on your experience, based on your seniority. Whereas in the private sector, if you're trying to break into private sector jobs, maybe doing similar things to what you might do for the government, you're going to have to know the right people. And we know from the research that folks of color and women of all colors and people with disabilities and other marginalized groups are less likely to have those connections. As a result, they go into government work not because they aren't good enough for the private sector or something like some would suggest, but because it is easier to not face discrimination there, or at least it has been until now. So I think you're on point when you say that. Now, not only are you on point about that part, but you're absolutely right. There is a decision, or there is a desire to get rid of anyone who does not endorse the sort of MAGA version of reality when it comes to government jobs. And I'm going to give you an example of that. So one of the executive orders that was signed on the very first day of President Trump's new administration is this thing called Reforming the Federal Hiring Process and Restoring Merit to Government Service. It's Orwellian doublespeak with all of these titles, right? What it does is a couple of things. It obviously targets diversity and inclusion efforts for marginalized group members in government, but then it does something else. It includes this really interesting section about what the criteria ought to be in order to be deemed qualified for a job with the government. So keep in mind, the titles suggest that the purpose is to emphasize objective merit, right? And the implication is DEI is against merit, which is a whole nother absurdity that we could discuss. But that's their argument. We want to restore merit. Now, when most people think of merit, they would think it was what? Like experience. How many years have you done this kind of job? What have your accomplishments been? But that's not how this executive order defines it. Here's what they say merit is. They call for a federal hiring plan that would, quote, prioritize recruitment of individuals committed to improving the efficiency of the federal government, passionate about the ideals of our American republic, and committed to upholding the rule of law and the United States Constitution. Now, on the one hand, that's crazy vague, right? I would endorse that. I think I'm upholding American values. I believe in the Constitution, but that's not, I'm not going to be eligible under that definition. You're not, and the vast majority of black and brown folks are not, because their understanding of American values would suggest that DEI is part of that. Promoting equity and fairness is, in fact, an American value. But clearly, if you read this executive order, they actually counterposition DEI to American values. So they're saying DEI is by definition un-American. Therefore, anyone whose ideology is not MAGA is now, by their definition of merit, unqualified to work for the government. It is a litmus test. It is essentially an ideological litmus test in order to get a job with the government. And the irony of that is it has nothing to do with your ability to do the job, right? The people who are in those jobs now who have years of experience, they've moved up the scale. You may not like the job title they have, but you can't deny that they know how to do it. And I'm not even talking now about DEI jobs. If you use that definition of merit in order to get a government job, they will basically be doing an ideological filtering for any job. There won't be DEI jobs, but even if you just want to be an office manager, or you're going to get a job as a mid-level manager, or you're going to be a personnel director, or you're going to be a project manager, do you have to have experience as a project manager? No, but you got to listen to Lee Greenwood and wear red, white, and blue clothing and go to the right church. There's no actual merit criteria other than, do you agree with Donald Trump? That's what they're actually looking to do.
Yeah, a lot of great points there. Take a few steps back and take their argument. Take their right wing and this 2024-25 argument that we heard on the campaign, that we've heard over and over around merit. Take it in good faith and help us understand why it's such nonsense. And I think the most kind of unoriginal comment that I've seen being made over and over, which is absolutely accurate and true, and it should be continued to be made, is that the most high profile appointments that Trump is making are wildly unqualified for their jobs. And you can include that kind of in this response, but take in good faith the argument that Hegseth made at his confirmation hearings about merit and a meritocracy in general, because the most pernicious and insidious thing I've heard in my years of hosting live radio is callers calling in saying, we all start in the same place. We all have the same opportunity. This is America. If you work hard, you can succeed. I was poor and now I'm rich. Stop making excuses. Pull yourselves up by your bootstrap. All of that ideology is so pervasive and so many people believe it, that's seemingly how they define kind of merit. So hopefully that gives you a starting point to pick up and take their argument in good faith.
Listen, if you assume that we already have an equal opportunity society and that the playing field is level and that everything is fine, then of course you would find DEI efforts, you would find affirmative action, you would find targeted recruitment, you would find all of those things to be not only illogical, but wrongheaded and maybe unethical and immoral. So of course, if that's where you start, that's where you'll end. I get it. The problem is, if you actually believe that we are an equal opportunity society, you are ignoring the evidence that is right before us in every measure of indication that you could possibly look at. We know, for instance, that black folks with college degrees in this country are almost twice as likely as whites with degrees in the same discipline, by the way, to be unemployed. Latinx folks with a degree about 50% more likely than whites with a degree to be unemployed. Indigenous folks about 2/3 more likely than whites with a degree to be unemployed. Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders with a degree about 20%, 15 to 20% more likely than comparable whites to be unemployed. Why is that? Even when they majored in the same thing, even when they went to comparable schools, they are still having a harder time finding work. It can't be because of merit. It must be about something else. We know from a research study done several years ago, but I doubt it's changed. It was shortly after the recession that about 45 to 50% of the new jobs in the economy after the recession of 2008 were being filled through word of mouth networks and specifically by getting letters of recommendation from people that already worked at the company or whatever to write for you to say, oh, Jim would be great or Bob would be great. That's fine in theory, but in practice, who's less likely to know the people who are in those networks? People of color and women of all colors. And by the way, working class white men also get screwed in that process. So we know we don't start from a level playing field. We know right now that black families who have a head of household who is a college graduate have about 25% less wealth on average than white households that are headed by a high school dropout. So if white households headed by a high school dropout are better off financially than black households headed by somebody that did everything right, did exactly what you told them to do, went to college, got a degree, and they're still worse off, then we're clearly not talking about a level playing field. But beyond the data piece of it, I just want us to recall that when people say we don't need to do any special efforts because black people and other folks of color already have equal rights and opportunity, please remember that white folks also said this was true before the Civil Rights Act even existed. I've pointed this out before many times, and I'll do it again. In 1963, the Gallup organization asked a large cross-section of white Americans, do you think black people have equal opportunity in education, housing, and jobs? And 2 out of 3 said yes. That is the year before the Civil Rights Act. That is 2 years before the Voting Rights Act. It is 5 years before the Fair Housing Act. And white folks are like, yeah, it's all good. And in 1962, which was only 8 years after Brown v. Board of Education struck down segregation in schools, the Gallup organization asked a different question. They said, do you think black children have just as good a chance to get a good education as white children? Now, it's only 8 years after Brown, and no school system had fully desegregated or taken steps to create equity. And yet 85% of white people that year said yes, that black children already had fully equal opportunity. So I guess my point is, when white folks say it's all good and we're on a level playing field, if we were saying that shit when black people were still getting hosed down by water cannons in the streets of Birmingham and Medgar Evers was getting shot dead in his driveway in Jackson, Mississippi, and George Wallace was standing in the schoolhouse door saying segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever, then I guess maybe white folks are deluded and need the history lessons that we're now banning for everybody in schools. That's why it's important to teach true history, because when you don't learn true history, you say stupid shit like the idea that we're a meritocracy already.
Boom. Yeah. Such great and important points. But it's always hard to prove a negative to folks who are radicalized by one version of history as well as their own life experience and their racist dad, who has been radicalized by Sean Hannity, who was radicalized by Rush Limbaugh before him, who is now a huge Tucker Carlson fan. It's hard to prove the negative that all of these initiatives, all these policies that we've talked about, that we've fought for, access to voting, starting there, getting to DEI initiatives, it's to prove the negative. Even anti-poverty ideas, the war on poverty, Paul Ryan said it failed because we still have poor people. How do you prove to people that these initiatives and these policies and these ideas have uplifted so many millions of Americans, created so much more opportunity? We have so much injustice, and indignancy would be the right emotion to realize still where we're at, even at the best point for minorities in this country. But how do you convince people who've been taught one way that these policies do in fact work? They are working. We need them to create more opportunity, which of course then they try to split the hair between equity and equality. How do you tell people that have been taught one way, Tim?
First, we need politicians that won't capitulate to the rhetoric of the right when they say these programs didn't work or they failed. First of all, the war on poverty, when we actually were fighting it, was working. If you actually look at the war on poverty from about 1960 to 1973, which were the 13 years that we expanded access to what was then called food stamps, expanded access to what was then called ADC or AFDC, cash welfare, it happens to be the fact that poverty dropped by about 45%. But after 1973, when we stopped increasing the payments to those programs to adjust them for inflation, when we began to scale back those programs, and then when Reagan's administration went all out warfare on those programs in the 80s, so they stopped contributing to those programs in a way that would keep pace with inflation, then people fell behind because they were getting benefit levels that were basically indexed to the early or mid 1970s. So when you fought the war, it was actually working. And a lot of the programs, keep in mind, food stamps, or what we now call SNAP, was not intended to end poverty. It was intended to stop malnutrition, which is a symptom of poverty. And it actually has done a pretty good job on that, according to several studies. Medicaid was never intended to end poverty. In fact, by definition, it can't, because you're only eligible for it if you're poor. So obviously the existence of Medicaid is not going to end poverty, but will it provide health care to people who are in poverty so that they don't get sicker or they don't die? Yes. Housing subsidies were not intended to end poverty. They were to make sure that poor people were not on the street. Has it done that? Yes, in many ways it has. Maybe not as much as we'd like, but we're judging these policies by criteria they were never intended to meet. And so part of it is that the Democratic Party and many started capitulating to this anti-social program rhetoric. Bill Clinton famously did this when he talked about ending welfare as we know it, which was not really welfare as we know it. It was welfare as the right wing was characterizing it. And so when he passed welfare reform in 1996, he capitulated to an idea that was false, that was based on false premises, but it locked the Democratic Party into the same bullshit narrative about people becoming dependent on welfare, even though the vast majority of people who get on public assistance are off within a year to 18 months. And right now, I should point out, when it comes to cash welfare, it's basically not a thing. There are exactly 2 million people in this country in any given month, 75% of whom are children, who I don't think can actually go into the workforce to earn their keep, but 2 million people in all who receive cash assistance. And of those 2 million people, of the 25% of those that are adults, which if you do the numbers on that, that's 385,000 or something adults, only about 1/3 of those are black. So the stereotype of black adults sitting around getting welfare payments for doing no work, there are only about 135 to 150,000 black adults in the entire United States who receive cash welfare in any given month in this country. I really want people to think about that, because there are 40 million black folks and all 30 million black adults in this country, and only 135,000 of them, which is like, what is that? 135,000 people would be, I think that's the size of maybe it's like the University of Michigan football stadium and then another 50,000 people, right? Or something like that. 160, 150,000 people who get cash welfare. If you were to ask the typical American, what percentage of black people who are adults get cash welfare, and then you told them, if you don't get this right within a factor of 10, I'm going to shoot you in the face, right? There wouldn't be enough white people left to have this conversation, because they would all say, oh, half of them, 30%. The low numbers would probably be 10%. But if you do the math, I don't know if you got a calculator in front of you, but like 135 to 150,000 out of 30 million, right? It's like, what, 1/3 of 1% or some outrageously low number? I'm trying to do it in my head and I can't figure it out, but it's a very low number. 9+% of black adults don't get this stuff. And yet people believe it because when that stereotype was promulgated 40, 45, 50 years ago, people didn't push back on it hard enough.
Let's get into specifically what they're doing right now and how you and your organization are trying to respond to it. They're really trying to erase not only history, like this Tuskegee Airmen news item that backfired apparently. And I don't know why they walk that back, but not the announcement that they're not going to celebrate things like Dr. King's birthday and Juneteenth and Holocaust Remembrance Day and LGBT things and so on that are recognized. So they're erasing things that are already here and present, achievements that have been made as well as history, but they're also weeding out organizations, schools, nonprofits that do anything to fight, I would argue, for civil rights, anti-discrimination. Exactly what all of your work does. Yeah. And so the federal government not funding any of it, it would be it seems like they're saying they're not going to fund anything that teaches something they don't like, but a lot of what they're teaching at colleges, institutions, and organizations is history and policy. You don't have to go do it or practice. It doesn't make you. It's education. It's a range of ideas. But how are you seeing that, and how are you combating that and reacting to it?
They're trying to create thought crimes like George Orwell's 1984 talks about. They're trying to ban entire concepts from consideration. If you and that's essentially for one reason. If you can remove the framework for understanding racial inequality in America, which is what, for instance, critical race theory tries to do. And there's a rumor on the street that they're going to do a new EO on that either later today or tomorrow to defund any K-12 school that uses CRT or whatever. But CRT, again, being so vaguely defined that, as we saw in his first administration and in 20 plus states around the country, that ends up applying to anything they don't want taught. And that does end up meaning any discussion of systemic racism at all is verboten. They actually say in many of these state laws that concept itself cannot be discussed, that the only way you can talk about racism is as a personal individual flaw and as a deviation from the norm of American equality of opportunity. But of course, the norm has not been equal opportunity. The norm in America has been inequality. We've only tried to create an equality norm in the last 55 to 60, maybe 70 years since Brown v. Board. So we ought to actually understand we're in an outlier position. The vast majority of American history has been about oppression and marginalization, but I would not be allowed to say that if I were a teacher, even in a history class with evidence, with documentation, because that kind of stuff is under the gun in 22 states currently, and also now about to be under the gun with federal policy. They are indeed threatening philanthropic foundations. They're threatening colleges and universities that have certain size endowments, saying that if they teach these concepts, which they consider to be divisive, or if they have trainings or DEI offices, that they may have their endowments seized. Again, an entirely illegal power grab, that they may have federal contracts canceled, that they may be disaccredited so that institutions of higher learning would lose their accreditation with the government, meaning they couldn't accept federal financial aid anymore. It would essentially close the institution. These are the kind of threats that dictators and autocrats make all the world over, not to actually debate ideas, not to say, hey, I disagree with CRT or I disagree with the argument here being made by the left, but to simply say the left doesn't have any right to even compete in the marketplace of ideas, that people who are on that side don't get the right to be heard. And these are the same people who insist that they believe in free speech, who insist that they don't believe in censorship, and they're angry about the censoring of conservative voices. And then they turn around and are trying to literally ban anything that goes against their hyper-nationalist perspective. Not only that, but the latest, one of the latest EOs that they're talking about, the one that would ban CRT, would also reinstitute or reorient, or I guess recreate the 1776 Commission, which was Trump's answer to the 1619 Project. And their whole purpose is to work to create a curriculum that is patriotic, keeping in mind that the whole idea behind that executive order is they're trying to get politics out of the schools, get ideology out of the schools. But hyper-nationalism is an ideology. Patriotism is an ideology. And that commission, when they put together their historical framework, it is ahistorical. There was not a single historian on the commission, and they essentially soft-pedaled and minimized and whitewashed enslavement, indigenous genocide, segregation, all the things that bring us up a little short as a country because they don't want us talking about that. That is indoctrination. That is the very thing they are accusing us of doing, they are doing. All we are trying to do is say that we ought to be able to bring an analysis to history that actually starts with the assumption that racism wasn't an accident, that it was in fact intentional. I believe I can prove that, but even if you disagree with it, then fine, we should be able to have the conversation. You can offer your historical perspective, I can offer mine. But in Trump world, you don't get to offer the perspective that critiques America. Everybody has to line up behind the great leader in his interpretation of history.
Yeah, because of the Orwell thing that you started that point with. And it's such a very well said point. What are you doing to combat it? What can we do? What can you at the African American Policy Forum do?
At AAPF, we're still formulating some of what our response is going to be. Obviously, we're going to have resources on our website, which is aapf.org, within the next several days that will direct people to different ways that they can contribute to this struggle. Right now, of course, there are lawsuits that are being filed by other organizations to stop some of these EOs. And some of those, as you mentioned earlier, have already been successful, and I'm sure will continue to be. But the biggest thing that we can do right now is to spread the truth about what these executive orders are and what their purpose is, to respond with facts where the other side is speaking with lies. We have to be sure that we're encouraging people not to give up in the face of this, not to fold, not to engage in essentially preemptive compliance. Because the danger here is not that these executive orders will actually necessarily be upheld. I think many, if not most, of the ones that we're talking about will be struck down even by the conservatives on this court, but if it gets that high. But before that, there will be institutions, there will be employers, there will be colleges, there will be K-12 schools and entire school systems that will throw up their hands in anticipatory compliance and fear and go, gosh, I don't want to get in trouble. I don't want to take any chances. I don't want to make our funders nervous. I don't want to make the parents mad. I better just do this so I don't catch a lot of flack. I'll just keep my head down and do my job. And that is the worst thing that can happen, because that is what fascists rely on. Most of what fascists rely on nowadays, it's not coming to your door with a gun and running down the street with a tank and obvious examples of fascism. In this country in particular, with a history and a tradition of relative liberty, it wouldn't work that way nearly as well. But it works very well if you can make a lot of noise and scare people into believing that somebody's going to say something mean to them or maybe get them in trouble. We saw this during the first Trump administration when the states began to ban divisive concepts. That was blatantly unconstitutional. And in fact, it's been found unconstitutional in a couple of courts already. And yet what has happened? You have state after state where teachers are openly saying, I'm just not teaching this stuff anymore because I don't want to get in trouble. You have teachers who are quitting their jobs because they're like, I'm not going to teach these lies that they want me to teach. But that's not a courageous stance, because then when you quit, they just replace you with one of their MAGA drones to teach what they want to teach. So we got all these people who are folding like a cheap tent because they don't want to stand up. They're afraid to stand up. People in government right now should be disobeying these executive orders. And I know there are people that say, oh, but Tim, that's easy for you to say. They'll lose their job. Look, they're going to lose their jobs anyway. That's the point, because there's an executive order coming that is going to essentially eliminate all of these positions. They're going to do Schedule F for government jobs, and they're going to go in and purge anyone who doesn't pledge allegiance to the administration. My guess is if you're somebody who is already in a position to do good work around equity or diversity, you're going to get shit canned anyway. So the idea that you don't want to disobey the executive order because you might get fired, okay, that's great. Wait around about 2 weeks and you're going to get fired. So you might as well disobey now. And then at least when they fire you, you might have a cause of action. You might actually be able to go to court. You might actually be able to claim that you've been injured by the policy. If you quit or if you refuse to do it, you have no cause of action to stop it.
Yeah. That sounds like pretty good advice. We're going to see what's going to happen with that in the next couple of weeks. Obviously, my last question was going to be about something very specific about Woken Day, and I just completely forgot it. But I feel like, Democrats, what do you think about the reaction right now from the rank and file in the House, in the Senate? They're having some big meeting today, which I think is good. And to a certain extent, I always give a lot of grace to the strategist. I have very little faith left and support for some of the old guard, some of which are very old and some have just been there too long potentially. But what do you make of the reaction from elected Democrats? And I like to be very specific. I mentioned the House and the Senate. In Iowa, they just took back the Senate with a huge triumph in Iowa. Democrats won a surprise victory there in a district, by the way, that was like 20 points for Trump. But my question to you is, what would you like to see? What are you seeing, and what would you like to see from electeds?
I would like to see 100% noncompliance with this administration. The idea that some are floating that we have to cooperate where we can and we have to pick our battles because the American people sent us here to get shit done. No, they didn't. If the American people cared about getting shit done, they wouldn't have put the Republicans with control of the government and total control of the government, since they didn't get anything done for the last 4 years and they had the House. They wouldn't pass any legislation. America is not trying to go bipartisan. The Democrats are always learning the wrong lesson every single time. This idea that if we're just a little more like the Republicans, or if we're nicer to them, that all the folks out in some diner in Nebraska are suddenly going to like us, that they're suddenly going to become progressive, no, they're not. There is a portion of this country, and it is not a small portion, that voted for Donald Trump, not in spite of his cruelty, not in spite of his bigotry, not in spite of his misogyny, but precisely for it. Yeah. And so the only thing that is left to do is to stand up and say, that's it. We will throw our bodies as lawmakers on the gears of this machine and shut it down. That's what they would do. And if the Democrats ever take back power, that's what they're going to do. The idea that we're going to play nice and we're going to be the adults in the room when America has clearly said that it prefers the baboon that throws shit on the walls, yeah, it's not going to work. The adults in the room clearly, like, maybe we'll get back to adults in the room at some point, but at some point you have to fight fire with fire. And that is exactly what the other side would do. This idea of being bigger people, and when they go low, go high. Notice even Michelle Obama has said enough of that crap. Like, she's done with that, and that was her line. So yeah. I don't see any reason for Democrats to hold on to it.
Yeah, no, all good arguments and points. All right, we're going to stay on top of you. I'm excited that you're going to be joining us in Vegas to talk about this, to inspire us, to educate us. That's going to be awesome. Where can people find most of what you're doing right now? You're posting on Blue Sky. Not enough for me. Yeah. I'd like to see more. I saw you took like a few hours off. It was upsetting.
Yeah, I am posting on Blue Sky. I still do actually post on Twitter or X, just because I think it's important to be on as many of these platforms. And I'm working on some articles and some Instagram videos, but I'm working with Kim Crenshaw and the good folks at African American Policy Forum. And we are going to be putting up some resources for folks. There are already some on the website that folks should check out. And there will be some more coming very soon at aapf.org.
I will see you, but I will talk to you sooner. Thank you very much for joining us today. It was really amazing.
Thank you, sir.
There he goes, Tim Wise, everybody. Ain't he the best? Tim Jacob Wise on social media. Get all of his books. Support him all the ways you can. He'll be joining us in Las Vegas, so you can meet him and personally thank him. And get your tickets now to PODJAM 2, March 28th to 30th. That is it. That's the show. I hope you liked it. Thank you for your support. I hope to see you at tonight's hangout. You bumblebees who listen all the way to the end, you're the very best. You mean so much to me. I'm so grateful that you're here. Namaste. Be well. Find your peace. Be mindful of the moments. Recognize your feelings in the moment and try to manage them the best that you can. Write in your journal. Get some rest. Talk to a friend. Help somebody out. Connect in our Discord platform anytime with other friends here in the stand-up community. John Carroll, johncarroll.org. Buy his music. Taking us out as he does every day. Take it away, John.